Hello friend, welcome to Stories by Tocci. We bring you interesting folk tales. Please don't forget to hit the like button, please share, and don't forget to subscribe to my YouTube channel. Thank you for doing so. Now let's get into the story. The mornings in Dara's home always began the same way, quiet, predictable, and wrapped in a kind of gentle chaos only a household with 4 children could know. She woke before the sun most days, padding through the soft hum of her still sleeping home in her robe, the scent of freshly brewed coffee already curling through the kitchen air. George always made it. He had done so for years, without fail, like clockwork. He'd kiss her forehead and mumble something about the traffic or a meeting, then sit quietly with her for 10 minutes before the kids began storming down the stairs. Dara would pack lunches, tie shoelaces, and smooth frizzy hair while reminding the twins not to fight before school. In those moments, everything felt stable, anchored in routine. Their house was neither too big nor too small, filled with children's drawings, laundry piles, and the soft buzz of life. To anyone watching, they were the picture of a happy family. Dara was loved, deeply so. George showed it in the way he spoke to her, and how he'd text her midday just to ask if she'd eaten, and how he never forgot her birthday, and how he still touched her back when they passed in the hallway. And yet, somewhere deep beneath the ordinary rhythm of their lives, something had started to flicker, something Dara couldn't quite name. She didn't talk about it, not even to herself. There was no affair, no betrayal, no arguments beyond the typical marriage squabbles. But over time, Dara began to feel a distance inside her, a hollow ache, like something had quietly slipped out of place. When George kissed her goodnight, she kissed back, but it felt more like a habit than a feeling. The little jokes they used to share during dinner now felt like echoes. Even her children, as much as she loved them, felt like parts of a life she had stepped outside of, like she was watching from behind a thick window. She couldn't place when it had started, maybe after their 4th child. Maybe during one of those long, quiet months when George was working overtime and the days all blurred into sameness. It wasn't depression, she thought. She laughed when people were around. She got things done. She just didn't feel much. It scared her sometimes how easy it was to smile and nod and go through every motion without really being present. No one suspected anything. Everyone thought she was content. And maybe she was supposed to be. But each night, lying in bed beside George's steady breathing, she felt a strange tightness in her chest, a question forming louder and louder in her mind. Is this it? Despite the quiet turmoil inside her, Dara clung to the life she had built. She reminded herself how lucky she was. George was good to her, loyal, hard-working, dependable. They never lacked anything. And yet, every time she drove past her old university, she felt a pang, a version of herself she barely remembered, filled with hunger and dreams and wild laughter. That girl felt long gone. Now, she spent most of her time worrying about grocery lists and school fees, flipping through recipe books she never had the energy to use. Sometimes, she'd find herself standing in the mirror, wondering when exactly her eyes had grown so tired. She still wore her wedding ring, of course, but some days she'd take it off before bed and just hold it, staring at it in the dim light. She didn't know what she was waiting for. Nothing had gone wrong. There was no real reason to feel the way she did. But something inside her, quiet, soft, persistent, was waiting for something to change. And in the silence of her heart, she knew that if it didn't, she might one day be the one to change it. It was on a quiet Thursday morning that Dara first noticed the new face in the office. She had arrived slightly later than usual, a rare thing for her, and the administrative wing was already buzzing with footsteps and low conversations. He was standing near the copier, his back turned to her, flipping through a sheaf of papers with one hand resting loosely on the machine like he'd been there for years. There was nothing immediately extraordinary about him, no flashy suit or loud introduction, but there was a certain quiet confidence in the way he held himself, like he wasn't trying to prove anything to anyone. Dara walked past him without a word, but she felt a strange awareness prickle at her skin, the way one might feel when someone's eyes follow you just a second too long. By mid-morning, word had spread. His name was Bayo, a systems analyst transferred from another branch. She learned he was married with 2 children, polite but reserved, and had a reputation for being exceptionally good at his job. When they finally exchanged words in the break room over coffee, it was nothing more than polite greetings and comments about how cold the air conditioning was. Still, when she returned to her desk, she couldn't stop thinking about the baritone warmth in his voice. Over the next few days, their interactions remained brief, passing remarks in hallways, shared laughter over a malfunctioning printer, casual nods during team meetings. But there was something Dara couldn't ignore. Whenever Bayo entered a room, her awareness of him sharpened, and though she told herself it was harmless curiosity, it felt like something else, something electric. He had a way of listening when she spoke, really listening, not just waiting for his turn to talk. She noticed the way his eyes held hers a fraction longer than necessary, how his smile was always subdued but never cold. He carried himself with a kind of ease that made other men seem overly eager or dull in comparison. She found herself watching him from across the room, noticing small things, how he adjusted his watch, how he leaned back when he laughed. There was nothing inappropriate, no lines crossed, but Dara felt it building in the quiet space between them, like standing near a fire and pretending she couldn't feel the heat. Her heart began to betray her with small flutters she hadn't felt in years, and though she told herself to pull back, to be careful, a small part of her was already leaning in. It wasn't long before the nature of their conversations changed. What began as small talk evolved into longer, more intimate discussions, often held in empty corridors or over extended lunch breaks. Bayo asked about her children, her interests, even her past, questions George hadn't asked in years. He listened to her stories like they were new, even the mundane ones, and Dara found herself wanting to tell him more. She didn't speak of George, and Bayo never mentioned his wife. There was an unspoken agreement between them, a careful dance around the boundaries of propriety. But beneath the surface, something stirred. One rainy afternoon, when they were both caught in the stairwell during a brief power outage, Dara found herself standing too close, her shoulder brushing his arm. Neither of them moved away. The lights returned after a few minutes, but the air between them had changed. She went home that evening more aware of her body than she'd felt in a long time. As she lay beside George, her mind drifted back to Bao's voice, the way he'd said her name as if it was worth savoring. Dara wasn't sure what was happening, only that something had begun, and once opened, certain doors do not close quietly. The first time it truly crossed the line, it wasn't planned. It never is. It happened on a Friday evening, after a long week of tight deadlines and back-to-back meetings. Most of the office had cleared out early, but Dara stayed behind to finish a report, and Bayo offered to help her with some figures that weren't balancing. They worked side by side in the quiet room, papers scattered between them, the hum of the air conditioner filling the silence. The atmosphere was calm, but charged, like something unspoken had been building, waiting for the right moment to break the surface. When they finally closed the last file, and Dara leaned back in her chair with a tired sigh, Bayo looked at her in a way that was no longer just friendly. She noticed the way his gaze dropped, then returned to her slowly, as if he had made a decision. "You need a drink after this week," he said, half smiling. She laughed, unsure if he was serious. But when she agreed and they ended up in a dimly lit lounge downtown, the seed that had been quietly growing between them finally rooted itself deep. At the bar, Dara let herself relax in a way she hadn't in years. The drinks were light at first, wine for her, whiskey for him, but it wasn't the alcohol that made her head swim. It was the way Bayo spoke to her, with full attention, like there was nothing else in the room but her. He asked about her youth, the music she liked, the first time she fell in love. He listened without rushing, responded with stories of his own. The conversation flowed so naturally it felt rehearsed by fate. By the third drink, they were sitting closer, their knees brushing under the table, neither pulling away. A song she liked came on, and she sang along under her breath. "You have a nice voice," he said quietly, eyes lingering. She looked down, suddenly shy, and that's when he reached out, just lightly, fingertips brushing against hers on the table. It was such a small touch, yet it cracked something wide open inside her. They left the bar not long after, walking under a faint drizzle. She should have gone home. She knew that. But when Bayo hailed a cab and asked, almost gently, "Just one more drink?" "My place isn't far," she nodded. Her lips trembled as she agreed, not out of fear, but because a part of her had already left her old life behind the moment she didn't say no. What happened in Bayo's apartment wasn't rushed or aggressive. It unfolded slowly, like it had been waiting patiently all along. They didn't speak much. The silences were full. His fingers trailed across her skin like he was trying to memorize her. Dara responded not with logic, but instinct, her body aching for a kind of attention she hadn't realized she missed. She gave in to it fully, letting herself fall, telling herself it was just a night, a slip. But when she left his apartment in the early morning light, her heels in her hand and her phone filled with missed calls from George, she didn't feel regret. She felt something worse, relief. A dangerous, terrifying relief. She told herself it wouldn't happen again, that she would return to her life, her children, her husband, and bury the night deep where no one could find it. But deep down, Dara already knew the truth. A line had been crossed, and once you learn how to live without it, pretending it was never drawn becomes the hardest lie of all. There was no grand decision to continue the affair, no whispered promises or emotional declarations. It simply happened again, and then again. What began as a single moment of weakness slipped into something far more dangerous, a pattern. They started meeting in small, hidden ways at first. A late lunch that ran too long, a cab ride after work that detoured far from home. The stolen hours turned into days they looked forward to with a kind of reckless anticipation. Dara started to live for those moments, when her phone would light up with his name, or when he'd brush his hand against hers in the narrow hallway between their office cubicles. Every touch carried weight now. Every glance was loaded. They didn't talk about what it meant, and they certainly didn't talk about their spouses. Their unspoken agreement kept the guilt manageable, like a secret pact between two people trying not to drown in the same deep water. At home, Dara perfected the act. She still packed lunches, helped with homework, and smiled at George when he told her about his day. But she began to feel like an actress playing the role of herself, repeating lines she no longer believed in. Her children's laughter echoed differently in her ears now, sometimes making her heart ache with guilt, and other times pushing her deeper into denial. She told herself she was still a good mother. After all, the kids were fed, cared for, loved. That was enough, wasn't it? Her relationship with George grew quieter. His questions became fewer, his touches less frequent, but not out of anger, more from unawareness. He trusted her completely, and that trust hung around her neck like a heavy chain. She began lying with ease, crafting excuses that grew more elaborate by the week. Late meetings, errands that turned into delays. Once, she told him her colleague had a medical emergency, and she had to stay at the hospital. In truth, she'd been wrapped in Bayo's arms in a small motel room off a quiet street, the hours melting into each other like candle wax. It wasn't just about the physical anymore. With each meeting, Dara felt more bound to Bayo, not by lust, but by the way he made her feel seen. He had a way of listening, of peeling back her layers without force. She'd find herself talking to him about her dreams, her fears, the loneliness she hadn't even admitted to herself until then. He never judged her. He told her he understood, that he felt trapped too, that his marriage was just routine, obligation. They started texting late into the night, exchanging small confessions and gentle flirtations. Sometimes she'd find herself smiling at her phone like a teenager, heart fluttering at the sight of his name. She began daydreaming more often about a life where they didn't have to sneak around, where they could be together without lies. The fantasy was intoxicating. It became her escape from the growing guilt, from the dull hum of her home life, from the parts of herself she no longer recognized. Dara wasn't falling anymore. She had already fallen. And every day she returned to Bayo, it became harder to imagine ever turning back. The first sign came in the form of nausea that refused to go away. At first, Dara thought it was stress. Her double life had become exhausting to maintain, and the weight of what she was doing often sat like a stone in her stomach. But when the queasiness continued past a week, accompanied by sudden fatigue and a strange tenderness in her body, she knew something was wrong. She didn't tell Bayo immediately. She didn't tell anyone. Instead, she walked into a pharmacy on a quiet afternoon, her sunglasses pulled low, her heart thudding in her chest as if someone might recognize the truth just by looking at her. Back at home, while the kids were in school and George was at work, she stood in the bathroom with the door locked, staring at the test strip as two faint pink lines slowly bloomed into view. Time seemed to stop. For a long while, she simply stood there, gripping the sink, breath caught somewhere between fear and disbelief. The silence in the room felt heavier than anything she had ever known. She didn't cry. Not at first. Instead, her mind began to spin through 1,000 scenarios, none of which led to peace. George couldn't be the father. She knew that with painful certainty. And the idea of carrying Bayo's child while still pretending at home was a line she couldn't convince herself to blur. That night, she told George. He was sitting at the edge of their bed, folding laundry, humming a tune he always sang without realizing it. When she told him she was pregnant and that the baby wasn't his, the humming stopped. He didn't move, not at first. His hands froze mid-fold. Then, slowly, he looked up at her, his face pale with confusion. "What are you saying?" he asked, though his voice was already breaking. Dara didn't flinch. She told him the truth with a steady voice, every word striking the room like cold rain. The betrayal in his eyes hurt more than she expected. But worse than the anger was his silence, how he simply stood, walked past her without a word, and left the room. That night, he slept on the couch. The next morning, he didn't speak to her. And for the first time in years, the house felt colder than the weather outside. With George emotionally checked out, Dara began to believe she had made the right choice. She had to. She clung to the idea that this child was a new beginning, a second chance at the kind of love she thought she had missed out on. She told Bayo a few days later, meeting him at their usual coffee shop. He was quiet as she spoke, stirring his drink too long, his eyes not quite meeting hers. When she told him she wanted to leave George and start a life with him, he nodded slowly, then said he needed time. "I'll talk to her," he promised, meaning his wife. "I just need to do it right." Dara believed him. She wanted to believe him. She had given up everything, her husband, her home, the version of herself she had spent years building. She was already making plans, searching for a place of her own, mentally dividing up holidays with the kids. But Bao's promises, though sweet, began to stretch. Days turned into weeks. His excuses grew more tangled. And though he never said it outright, Dara could sense it, that hesitation in his voice, that uneasiness in his eyes. Still, she told herself it was temporary. That love, real love, was never simple. She had already stepped into the fire. Now, all she could do was wait to see what would burn. The days began to stretch unbearably long, stitched together with unanswered texts and vague promises. Dara tried to be patient. She told herself Bayo just needed time, that dismantling a life wasn't as quick as packing a suitcase. But each passing day, without a clear answer, left her stomach tighter, her nights lonelier. She had moved into a small apartment not far from her old home, the kind of place that echoed too loudly in the silence. The kids stayed with George for the time being. They didn't understand why Mommy was suddenly in a different house, or why Daddy never came along when she visited. Dara painted the walls soft colors, tried to make it feel like a fresh start, but the place never quite felt like home. She told herself Bayo would be with her soon, that this was the price for happiness. But deep inside, beneath all the rehearsed patience and forced optimism, a gnawing fear had begun to grow, one she dared not name out loud. Bayo's visits became unpredictable. Sometimes he'd show up late at night, tired and moody, offering only a kiss and half an apology before falling asleep beside her. Other times, he'd cancel last minute, citing complications at home, or timing that just didn't feel right. Dara tried not to press too hard. She asked questions carefully, trying not to sound like she was nagging. But she began to notice things, a ring mark on his finger even though he claimed not to wear it anymore, perfume that wasn't hers lingering on his shirt, an evasiveness in his eyes that hadn't been there before. She started to feel like a guest in his life rather than the woman he loved. One evening, she brought it up, gently but directly. When, she asked, when will it really be us? Bayo sighed, rubbed his temples, and gave her the same answer he always did. Soon, Dara. I promise. Just let me handle things my way. But his eyes didn't match his words, and Dara felt something cold settle inside her chest, like a door quietly closing from the other side. The loneliness became unbearable. Dara had imagined this life so differently. She thought leaving George would feel like liberation, like stepping into her truth. Instead, she felt more adrift than ever. She rarely saw her children now. Visits were awkward, strained, full of questions she couldn't answer. George remained distant but calm, focused entirely on the kids and his work, never once begging her to come back. That hurt more than she expected. She missed the steady sound of his voice, the way he used to hum while shaving, the quiet comfort of his presence. And with Bayo, things only grew colder. He stopped staying the night. He answered fewer calls. One day, after a particularly emotional conversation in which she begged him to make a decision, she threatened him. She didn't mean to. The words just came out. If you don't leave her, you'll never see this baby. I swear. As soon as she said it, she regretted it, but the silence on the other end of the call was worse than any argument. He hung up without a word. That night, Dara sat alone in the apartment she had once called their future, curled on the couch, listening to the rain beat against the windows. She had never felt so far from everything she once knew. The morning Bayo showed up at her office, Dara had barely slept. She had spent the previous night pacing her living room, her body sore from the pregnancy, her mind spiraling with thoughts she couldn't control. The silence from Bayo had stretched for nearly 4 days. No calls, no texts, not even a message asking about her health. She had tried to convince herself he just needed space, that the pressure had pushed him into retreat. But the truth had started to seep in like cold water. Maybe he had already made his choice, and it wasn't her. That morning, her face was pale in the bathroom mirror. She layered concealer beneath her eyes and told herself to stay calm, to act like nothing inside her was unraveling. But when she walked into her office and saw him standing there, motionless, in the middle of the room, her breath caught. Bao's eyes looked hollow, sunken, like he hadn't slept either. His shirt was half-buttoned, his collar askew. Something was wrong, terribly wrong, and before she could speak, he closed the door behind him, locking it with an eerie calm. He didn't say anything at first, just stood there, holding something inside his jacket. Dara could feel the tension stretch across the room like a rubber band about to snap. Her voice trembled when she said his name, but he didn't respond. Instead, he reached into his coat and pulled out a black pistol, holding it down by his side. For a moment, she thought he was going to point it at her. She backed up instinctively, her heart pounding so loudly she thought it might break through her chest. But then he turned it on himself, pressed it against his heart, and looked at her with a kind of pain that defied explanation. I can't do this anymore, he whispered. I tried to fix it. I really tried. Dara's hands shook as she stepped forward, pleading now, voice cracking. Bayo, don't. Please, we can talk. There's time. Just put it down. But he didn't. His eyes filled with something dark and final. I ruined everything, he said, and then, before she could reach him, the sound of the gunshot split the air like glass shattering. Blood bloomed across his shirt like a spreading shadow, and his body crumpled to the ground in a slow, horrifying collapse. Dara screamed, a sound so primal and raw it didn't feel like her own. She dropped to her knees beside him, her hands soaked in red, trying to stop the bleeding, trying to bring him back with words and shaking hands and desperate cries. But his eyes were already empty, his chest rising once, then not again. Time lost all meaning in that room. People came. Sirens. Hands pulled her away. But all she could see was the stillness on his face. All she could feel was the weight of what she'd lost. Not just Bayo, but the last thread of the fantasy she had clung to. The guilt, the lies, the betrayal, none of it could be undone. And now, in one brutal moment, the man she thought she'd risked everything for was gone. Forever. The days following Bao's death moved in a blur, like watching the world through fog glass. Dara floated through them, present but unreachable, as if her body kept going while her mind stayed frozen in that office, on that cold floor stained with his blood. Her screams still echoed in her ears long after the noise had faded, long after the paramedics had taken his body away and the police had finished their questioning. She barely remembered what she told them, only fragments remained. He was under pressure. I didn't know he would. He wasn't like that, but what haunted her most wasn't the sight of him dying. It was the memory of the way he looked at her, defeated, broken, resigned. As if he had already given up long before the bullet tore through his chest. She replayed that look over and over again in her mind, searching for some sign she had missed, some moment she could have changed. But all she found was silence, the kind that deafens. Bayo's wife made everything worse. She didn't show up in rage. No, her fury was the quiet, methodical kind, the sort that destroyed everything in its path without raising its voice. She called Dara 3 days after the funeral, her tone cool and eerily calm. "You took everything from me," she said. "Now live with it." The call didn't last long, but its weight stayed with Dara. Word spread fast. Colleagues avoided her. Neighbors whispered. Old friends stopped answering messages. Even her own children looked at her differently now, confused and distant. George, still quiet and composed, limited their interactions to logistics, pickup times, school forms, medical appointments. He never asked how she was coping, never said a word about Bayo. His silence screamed louder than any confrontation could. Dara's world had shrunk to the walls of her apartment and the ever-growing ache inside her. Sleep became a stranger. Her body, still carrying the child she once thought would mark a new beginning, now felt like a cruel reminder of what she had lost. With nowhere to place her grief, Dara turned inward. She stopped going to work. She left food untouched. Her apartment grew dim and unkempt, curtains drawn tight against the world she no longer recognized. Each morning she woke up hoping the nightmare had ended, but each morning proved it hadn't. She thought often about calling George, not to fix anything, but just to hear a voice that knew her before everything shattered. But pride, or maybe shame, kept her silent. Instead, she sat in the dark most days, rubbing her growing belly, whispering to the child that wasn't even born yet. "I'm sorry," she'd say, over and over, as if the words could change what had already been done. But there was no comfort in apologies, no peace in regret, only the slow, crushing realization that she was alone now, in every sense of the word, and the life she had tried to build, the one she'd torn everything apart to chase, had turned to ashes in her hands. Dara's days began to melt into each other, undistinguished, colorless stretches of time that passed with no meaning, no direction. She stopped marking the days of the week, stopped opening her curtains. The apartment took on a sour, stale smell, and laundry piled in forgotten corners, like reminders of a life she no longer had the strength to manage. The only sounds were the creaks of the old building and the occasional groan of pipes when someone upstairs turned on their tap. Every now and then she'd sit in the hallway for hours, just listening to the faint hum of the outside world she had withdrawn from. She barely responded to messages from her family, ignoring her sister's gentle check-ins and declining calls from George, who had begun insisting she come to doctor's appointments. She didn't want to be touched, didn't want to be seen. The thought of going outside, of meeting anyone's eyes, felt unbearable. She had become a ghost, haunting her own life. It started with the pills, a few at first, stolen from an old prescription she found buried in the back of a drawer. They didn't make the pain disappear, but they softened it, turned the sharp edges into something duller. She liked that. Soon, she began to need them just to get through the day. When the old bottle ran out, she begged a former coworker to lend her something stronger, feigning a bad back, a migraine, whatever lie came easiest. Then came the alcohol. Not in excess at first, just a glass to help her sleep, to quiet the thoughts that screamed in her head at night. But the glass turned into bottles. The haze became her shelter. She started mixing things, chasing a numbness she couldn't quite reach. The pregnancy slowed her down, but not enough to stop. There were nights she would sit on the floor of the bathroom, gripping the edge of the tub, the bottle on one side and her stomach on the other, crying until her voice gave out. She didn't recognize herself anymore, and she didn't care. It was easier this way, to be lost, to forget. I'd sorry forget harbor on the bombes so manis, with those almost vice children, imperious are by the mountains. To forget, and Bakanda's bird with squares. I do dear and take shares, and balls brace, on blues and disastline persetis, a minus, or pride gesture. Shermy McKinnis Prebis, horritic skip. One evening, when the rain was beating hard against the windows and she hadn't eaten in 2 days, Dara stood in front of the mirror and barely recognized the woman staring back. Her eyes were sunken, her skin pale and puffy, lips dry and cracked. She looked older, worn, like life had been scraped from her layer by layer. She ran a trembling hand down her stomach, now rounded and full of movement, and a wave of guilt rose so violently she had to sit down. What kind of mother was she? What kind of life was she bringing this child into? The question echoed through the room unanswered. In that moment a sob escaped her throat, not from grief alone, but from something deeper. Despair. She had lost everything, her family, her dignity, her sense of self, and now she was unraveling completely. Dara wasn't just broken. She was sinking, and no one was coming to pull her out. It was a knock on the door that finally stirred something in her. Not loud, not urgent, just a soft, steady sound that broke through the silence like a distant heartbeat. Dara sat up on the couch, dazed, a blanket twisted around her legs, an open bottle rolling gently on the floor. Her head pounded, her mouth was dry, and her body felt swollen, aching in places she could no longer ignore. The knock came again. She waited, unsure whether to answer or pretend she wasn't there. But something inside her, fragile and flickering, urged her to stand. When she opened the door, it was her sister. Chin trembling, eyes brimming with quiet worry. She didn't speak at first, just stepped inside, looking around at the chaos, the smell, the shadows cast by curtains that hadn't been drawn in weeks. Without judgment, she took Dara's hand and led her to the kitchen, opened the windows, filled a glass of water. Dara watched her, too numb to resist, too tired to explain. For once, there were no words, just the sound of life slowly re-entering the space. In the following days, her sister stayed, not to fix everything, because some things couldn't be fixed, but to help Dara remember how to exist again. She helped her clean, gently coaxed her to shower, cooked small meals, and left them on the counter without pressure. She never asked about Bayo or George or what had happened in between. She only spoke when Dara was ready. And slowly, something shifted. Not a healing, not yet, but a pause in the spiral. Dara began to feel the baby move more often now, strong and steady beneath her skin, as if reminding her that life still pulsed forward, even when everything else had fallen apart. One morning, she sat by the open window, the cool breeze on her face, and felt the baby kick. She placed her hand there, over the flutter, and for the first time in a long time, her tears weren't from pain, they were from something else. A fragile sense of presence. She was still here, still breathing, still holding on. Weeks passed. The apartment slowly transformed from a cave of despair to something resembling shelter. She didn't speak to George often, but when she did, there was less tension in his voice. He was cautious, protective of the children, still distant, but he asked how the pregnancy was going, and once even offered to drive her to a checkup. Dara didn't know what would come next. She didn't pretend to believe in redemption, not fully. Too much had happened. Too much had been lost. But she was learning to live with the weight instead of running from it. The nights were still hard. The guilt still hovered, a shadow never too far behind. But she was present now, in the ache, in the quiet, in the small moments that remained. The woman she had been before was gone. So was the life she had destroyed. But from the wreckage, something else had begun to rise. Not a clean slate, not a fairy tale. Just a slow, aching return to herself. And for the first time in months, Dara believed she might survive. Not because she deserved to, but because she had to. For the child, for the fragments of a life that still waited to be rebuilt. Hope you enjoyed this interesting story. Please don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to my channel. See you again in my next story.